Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about 3 wacky rig mistakes that I see a lot that cost you fish. While this is an easy technique to just throw around and catch a bunch of fish, with the spawn coming up, this is really going to shine. But if you do these 3 things, they will keep you from catching the most amount of fish that you possibly can. So stay tuned. Let's get right into it. By the end of today's video, you're going to be catching more fish on a wacky rig than you ever thought was possible. So like I mentioned in the intro, this is a super easy technique to fish. You don't even need a bait caster. You can put it on a spinning rod. It's super easy for beginners to do. All you have to do is hook a stick worm in the middle and cast it around and let it sink, and the fish will come bite it. But there are 3 things that I've learned over the years of throwing a wacky rig that if you do these, not only will you get more bites, but you will land more fish that actually bite on your bait. So we're going to start with one that will actually get you more bites on the wacky rig, and then the following 2 will be a key on how to land more fish when you actually get a bite and make sure your wacky rig is working properly in the water. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your worm choice. The stick worm that you actually put on your senko is the biggest key to getting more bites on your rig because of how the bait will fall. Not all stick worms are created equal on the market. There are very few that actually work on a wacky rig. I know I've talked about bitter stick worms before. I think they're called the salty slings. They're actually terrible on a wacky rig because they do not have enough density to actually sink and work properly in the water. They work amazing for flipping grass down in Florida. They work amazing on a light Texas rig fishing big grass flats where fish are spawning, but they are not made for fishing on a wacky rig. A couple other examples that come to mind are the yum dingers and the big bite baits stick worms. Again, those are excellent for flipping stick worms into grass and stuff like that. They're excellent for dragging them for spawning fish, doing that kind of stuff, Carolina rigs, anything where you are putting a weight on the bait. But they're not good on a wacky rig. There are a few stick worms out there on the market that actually work very well on a wacky rig. They'll work good for the other techniques as well, but they also work good on a wacky rig because ultimately the worm is your weight on a wacky rig. And what you want is a bait that has enough density that it will sink at a higher rate of speed. You don't want it falling to the bottom really fast because that defeats the purpose of a wacky rig, but there's a certain density that if those baits are reached, they have that perfect natural fall, but you don't have to stand there forever and let those baits sink. A lot of these baits, I've thrown yum dingers on a wacky rig. You'll skip it up under a dock, and depending on the hook that you put on there, they will almost suspend. They sink so slowly, and that is not the action that you're looking for. You want that shimmy on the way down as that stick worm is working its way to the bottom. So there are 4 stick worms that come to mind that I would be willing to put on a wacky rig. I have tested every single one of these. Like I've said, I've gone through the gauntlet of all the different stick worms to try on a wacky rig. There are 4 that I would be willing to put on a wacky rig. So the first one that I would recommend on a wacky rig is going to be the Bass Pro Sticko. The Sticko is one of them. These are awesome. You can get them in big bulk packs at Bass Pro Shops for like 10 bucks. You get about 30 in a pack. They rip up pretty easily just like any other stick bait, but that's part of the nature. If they're ripping easily, usually they're dense enough to actually get bites because they have the right amount of salt in there. And if you're catching fish, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. So that's one that I really like to recommend. Another one, don't have one here, they're in the boat right now. Gary Yamamoto Senko's the old favorite. That one will always work and always will. That is one of the best Senkos for a wacky rig. Another one of my favorites is the Berkley Max Scent General. That one, when they soak it with all that stuff, the juice or whatever they put in there for scent, that gives it enough density to sink as well. And then one of my new favorites here is the Sixth Sense Clout worm. So I have a whole bunch of these. This is the 5.4 clout. They have that density that you need. They have the shimmy that you need. That's what you're looking for in that senko. It's going to get you more bites at the end of the day. That type of stick worm action. And if you want to get any of these Sixth Sense ones, you can use my code Quince. You'll save 10% off your whole order on the website, and you'll be supporting the channel out a ton. We'll talk a little bit about color as well. I like black and blue, especially up here on these northeast lakes. One of my favorites, especially when that water gets a little stained. I use a ton of green pumpkin. That's one of my favorites. If I only had 2 colors, I'd go black and blue and green pumpkin. And then one of my favorite colors that is actually in this clout worm here, I've been using it for a while. I've actually learned it down south on Pickwick. when the fish were feeding heavily on bluegills. It's a color called Green Pumpkin Burst, and it has a bunch of different types of glitter in here. Mostly it's a holographic type, so it reflects different colors, but it looks like a lot of silver and gold. That color, when they're feeding on bluegills and you have just a little bit of sun, that reflects really well. It draws the fish's attention. I've caught a ton of fish on this Green Pumpkin Burst color. So those would be the 3 colors I would recommend: Green Pumpkin Burst, and Green Pumpkin in black and blue. Now, my second mistake that I've noticed on a Wacky rig, this is one I made for a very, very long time and could not understand why I kept losing fish. You lose a ton of fish depending on your hook choice. So there is one that I switched to. It is my favorite one. I have been using it for a while, and my landing ratio since switching to this new hook has been incredible compared to what I used to use. So the number one thing that I see used all the time are these little circle octopus type Wacky hooks. They're great for Wacky hooks. They do work, but you will lose some fish on them. And the reason being is that the hook is so short. It might have a wide gap, but the actual shank of the hook is very short. And what will happen is these fish will bite this bait, you'll go to lean into them with a hook set, and as that bait is pulling out of the fish's mouth and it goes to hook the fish in the roof or corner of the mouth or wherever, you will just get some skin and it'll go in front of their jawbone or wherever to actually peg the fish really well. It won't hook the right amount of meat in that fish's mouth, and you'll end up losing fish because you're not getting a deep enough hook set. When I switch to this hook right here, this is the VMC Nico hooks. I like a size 2, but I also go up to a size 1. This is actually the weedless version with the 2 fluorocarbon weed guards. It works awesome on lakes we fish up here that have a ton of grass around docks. But if you don't have that type of cover, you could just go with the straight exposed hook and get even better hook sets. The reason this one works so well, it has the same size gap as this Wacky hook, but it has a longer shank. So when you set the hook on a fish, it is going to get meat back there behind its jawbone or whatever little cartilage pieces are on the outside of that fish's mouth, specifically on bigger fish or smallmouth is where I've really noticed this. They have a lot denser mouths, and when it'll get hooked behind there, those fish do not come off. You can play them around the boat, you can take your time with them, let them pull drag, it will not wear a hole in their mouth. When you get a hook sometimes with these Wacky rigs and it's in the corner of their mouth, if it's before that cartilage on the outside, as you're playing them down, you'll actually start wearing a hole in that cartilage and it'll start opening up, and then if it makes a good jump, this hook is so small and light wire, it can just pop back out. Where if you have this Nico hook, it's most likely going to be behind the bone, and you're going to keep that fish on much longer with this hook right here. And my last tip for making sure your bait is working properly in the water and to actually land more fish is going to be to go to a high-vis green or yellow braid as your main line, and I will use an 8-pound test fluorocarbon leader. It doesn't have to be 8-pound test fluorocarbon leader. You just want a 10-foot section or so of fluorocarbon, whatever pound test you like. If you like fishing open water, you can go 6-pound test. You could use 10-pound if you're around cover. All that's going to do is keep the fish from seeing this lime green braid if you're worried about them seeing it. I use the leader all the time. It's just a habit that I'm in now. It doesn't matter what the water clarity is. It could be super dirty or crystal clear. I'm going with that fluorocarbon. The reason that I use the braid though is that it floats and it's super visible. So especially on calmer days, this is when this is really going to help you out. Especially dock fishing. This is where I learned it. This is why I use it now. I'll skip my bait up under a dock. When it lays on the water, you can see what your braid is doing. So I'll watch the braid and you can see it start to go out real slowly. And that's because your senko is slowly shimmering down to the bottom. And you'll either see your line physically jump because the fish have sucked that bait into their mouth and you know that there's one on there. You don't have to feel if there's a fish. All you know is reel down your slack and set the hook. They have already eaten it. You'll get a better hook set because they have that all the way down their throat right now. Rather than you reeling up to feel if they're there, they'll start to spit that bait out and it'll be on the way out as you're setting the hook. You'll get a better hook set because you know that that fish has already eaten it. The other thing that you'll know, that line will lay slack on the water, so you know it'll be on the bottom, and you'll need to like work your bait a little bit. And the last thing that thing really does for me, you can watch this lime green braid. Oftentimes I'll be fishing a dock. You'll skip it up next to a dock. and you'll see the line start to curve underneath the dock and pull away from the straight cast that you had made. And that's because a fish has picked that up and is swimming away with it. Again, that you have a bite, you can crank down on this and get a really good hook set on a fish. You know that it has already eaten it. All you have to do is reel the slack out and set the hook, and you're gonna land more fish that way. So if you enjoyed today's video and you wanna see a video on what type of worms you should be using, what colors, go ahead and check this video out right here where I talked about worm color to save money there. Leave a like down below and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up.